On August 31st, 1944, General George S. Patton stood inside a makeshift field headquarters near Reims, France, leaning over a map that didn't stop at the Rhine. His finger moved past borders and rivers, past towns most Americans couldn't pronounce, toward the heart of Germany itself. Outside, Third Army's columns, dusty, battered, relentless, had just done something that felt almost unreal, even to the men who lived it. In barely 3 weeks, they had ripped across France like a thrown blade, covering hundreds of miles while German units broke, scattered, and ran. It wasn't a slow push. It was pursuit, raw momentum. An army moving so fast the enemy couldn't even decide where the front line was. The Siegfried Line, that jagged legend of concrete and steel, lay close enough on paper to feel like a promise. Victory didn't feel distant anymore. It felt near, tangible, like one last door that only needed a hard kick. Then the phone rang. Patton turned, expecting another report, another opportunity, another gap discovered by scouts. Instead, it was General Omar Bradley, and Bradley's voice had that careful, measured tone commanders use when they already know the words will land like shrapnel. "George," Bradley said, "I've got orders from Eisenhower. Your fuel allocation is being cut, effective immediately." For a moment, Patton didn't answer, because the sentence didn't fit the reality outside his tent. His tanks were poised within striking distance of Germany, but tanks don't run on anger or ambition. They run on gasoline. His spearheads were sitting like clenched fists, with no strength in the fingers. The war that felt close enough to end before winter suddenly stretched out longer, darker because somewhere far behind the dust and gunfire, someone had decided the fastest army in France would be forced to slow to a crawl. To understand why Patton's rage was immediate, and why so many men around him felt a cold, sinking dread, you have to understand what Third Army had just accomplished, and what kind of moment late summer in France truly was. On July 25, 1944 Operation Cobra finally cracked the German line in Normandy. For weeks after D-Day, Allied forces had been trapped in hedgerows, fighting for every field like it was a fortress. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Men bled for crossroads. Tanks were forced into narrow lanes where ambush waited behind every bend. The Germans, even in retreat, fought with stubborn skill. Then Cobra turned the lock, and once that lock broke, the door blew open. Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1st, 1944, and from the moment it entered the fight, the tempo changed. Where others advanced carefully, Patton pursued. Where others paused to consolidate, Patton pressed. Within a matter of weeks, Third Army was cutting through France at a speed that stunned both allies and enemies. While other forces were still wrestling with strongpoints and reorganizing, Patton's armored columns were already far beyond yesterday's battlefields, hunting tomorrow's. It wasn't just movement, it was a method. Strike, bypass, encircle, keep going. Never give the enemy time to rebuild. His corps commanders learned quickly what he demanded. One asked how fast they should push. Patton's answer became a legend because it sounded like madness, and because it was exactly how Third Army fought. Advance until the tanks run out of gas. Then get out and walk. That wasn't a joke. That was his philosophy. Momentum was not a luxury. Momentum was a weapon. By the final days of August, Patton's leading elements had reached the Moselle River. The Lorraine corridor, an opening through weak German defenses, looked like a road straight into the Saar industrial region. It wasn't just attractive terrain, it was strategic oxygen. German formations were battered from the retreat across France. Their command structure was shaken. Their reserves were thin. Later, German officers would admit that in that window, those precious days, defenses in many places were barely held together by desperate improvisation. Patton's intelligence officers saw it. Patton sensed it. This was the moment when pressure could turn retreat into collapse. He calculated what he needed to keep the chase alive, roughly 400,000 gallons of fuel a day to maintain the pace. Through much of August, he had been receiving something close to what the advance required. It still wasn't comfortable. Nothing about Allied logistics in 1944 was comfortable, but it was enough to keep the engine roaring. Then, at the end of August, the engine began to starve. On August 28, 1944, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced the problem that haunts every army once it breaks out of a battlefield and starts racing across open distance. Supply. The Allies had landed in Normandy, and Normandy was still their lifeline. The port of Cherbourg had been taken, but even that wasn't a magical solution. Vast amounts of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts still had to travel forward across wrecked roads and damaged rail lines. Antwerp had been captured, but it wasn't yet functioning as the supply miracle everyone wanted. The Scheldt still had to be cleared. Until then, the Allied advance was like a powerful runner breathing through a straw. There simply wasn't enough to support every army charging at full speed. Someone had to be prioritized. Someone had to wait. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery argued for a concentrated blow in the north, one heavy thrust through the Low Countries, across the Rhine, aimed at the Ruhr. It was bold. It was dramatic. It promised a quick ending if it worked. Montgomery insisted that, with the right resources, he could break the war open and finish it by Christmas. Eisenhower, managing not just armies but an alliance, listened. And Eisenhower agreed. Patton didn't hear that explanation first. He didn't hear the reasoning. He heard the result. On August 31st, 1944 the roar of Third Army's engines didn't just quiet. It died. Fuel allocations were reduced to a trickle, barely enough to keep vehicles idling, barely enough to move small elements, nowhere near enough to keep armored columns tearing into Germany. Thousands of tanks that had been racing across France now sat silent in muddy fields near the Moselle, their crews smoking, waiting, staring at maps that mocked them. Men who had tasted victory in motion now tasted something else. Stillness. The kind of stillness that lets an enemy breathe again. Patton's anger was immediate and volcanic. He called Bradley, and the exchange didn't last long because Patton didn't do polite frustration. He did fire. "We've got the enemy on the run," he snapped. "And you're stopping me because of some stupid theory about a single thrust." Bradley understood him. Bradley sympathized. But Bradley had orders. The fuel and support were flowing north, feeding Montgomery's coming operation. Patton's offensive, his open road, his chase would have to wait. Patton was not the kind of man who accepted the word wait the way other generals did. He called in his quartermaster, Colonel Walter Muller, and gave him instructions that would never appear in a manual. "I don't care how you do it," Patton said. "Find me fuel. Use your imagination." Muller understood exactly what that meant. Third Army's logisticians didn't simply request supplies and hope bureaucracy kept pace with the front. They hunted supplies. They seized them. They redistributed them. They set up checkpoints along roads and rerouted convoys meant for other units. They showed up at depots with papers that looked official enough and loaded trucks before anyone could question it. They intercepted shipments moving forward and quietly redirected them south. It was audacious, sometimes borderline criminal, and it worked often enough to keep Patton's army from becoming completely immobile. Complaints began to flow toward Bradley like a rising flood. Units would arrive to collect what had been allocated, only to find the depot mysteriously empty. Shipments were tracked on paper and then vanished into the chaos of the road network, only to reappear behind Third Army lines. Officers grumbled, staffs protested. The words theft and piracy were used in angry briefings. Patton's answer was always the same, as blunt as a fist. Supplies belong to whoever can use them to kill Germans. Right now, that's us. Patton called it aggressive logistics. His critics had harsher names, but behind all of it was one cold reality. An army that stops in the middle of pursuit gives the enemy a gift no weapon can match: time. While Patton struggled and scavenged, Montgomery's 21st Army Group received priority on nearly everything. The coming operation, Market Garden, was enormous in ambition and appetite. It was a plan built on speed too, but a different kind. Airborne troops would drop behind German lines in the Netherlands, seize key bridges, and open a corridor for ground forces to race along a single highway toward the Rhine. The resources committed were staggering. Transport aircraft, gliders, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, engineering equipment, everything needed to support one grand spear aimed at the heart of the Reich. Eisenhower's logic was strategic. One concentrated strike, if it succeeded, could outflank the Siegfried Line and put Allied forces across the Rhine. It would be a shortcut through the brutal, fortified belt that lay ahead. If Montgomery's gamble worked, it could end the war sooner. But if it didn't work, the cost would be more than numbers. On September 17, 1944 Operation Market Garden began. 35,000 airborne troops descended into the Netherlands, parachutes blooming like pale flowers in the sky. On the ground, armored columns began to push up that single narrow road, trying to reach the bridges before the Germans could react. It was one of those operations that looks like genius when you draw it on a map. Then reality arrived. The road became a funnel. The German response hardened faster than planners expected. The corridor was fragile, one highway exposed on flat terrain, vulnerable to ambush, artillery, and counterattack. At Arnhem, British airborne troops discovered the worst kind of surprise. Enemy armored forces that were supposed to be shattered were not shattered enough. They were there. They were organized. They were deadly. The men at the farthest bridge fought with an almost desperate courage, holding in ruins and smoke while relief failed to arrive in time. In other sectors, American paratroopers clung to their objectives under relentless pressure. The highway became a shooting gallery. Every stalled vehicle created a jam. Every jam created a target. The operation began to bleed. By September 25, 1944 Market Garden was finished. The bridge at Arnhem had not been held. The promised crossing of the Rhine did not happen. The evacuation came under darkness and rain, and thousands of casualties, especially among the British 1st Airborne, were the grim price of an operation that had promised the opposite of what it delivered. It had not ended the war by Christmas. It had not broken into Germany. It had not outflanked the Siegfried Line. And while it burned through men and material in the north, Patton remained in Lorraine with the same strangled fuel situation he had endured since late August. His engineers built bridges over the Moselle. Recon units probed defenses that grew stronger every day. Infantry consolidated positions and fought where they could. But the armored punch that had carried Third Army across France, the speed, the shock sat cold and idle more often than it moved. Patton wrote with barely controlled fury that his men could tighten their belts and endure hunger, but his tanks needed gas. He lobbied Bradley constantly, laying out plans, routes, and opportunities, insisting that with even modest fuel, he could resume the advance and keep the Germans off balance. Bradley listened, because Bradley could see what Patton saw. Every day of delay was a day the Germans used to rebuild, but Eisenhower remained committed to the northern priority. Even after Market Garden's failure, the strategic focus shifted to opening Antwerp by clearing the Scheldt estuary. Vital work, necessary work, but slow. The Great September opportunity, when German formations were disorganized and the Allied front was surging, was slipping away. The weather began to change. Autumn rains turned roads to mud. Shorter days reduced air support windows. The enemy that had been running in August began to stand again in September, and by October, the Germans were not just retreating, they were digging in, fortifying, replacing losses, rebuilding command structures, doing exactly what Patton had feared they would do if allowed to survive the pursuit. Then, 3.5 months later, the war reminded everyone what a recovered enemy could do. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched their last desperate offensive in the west, the Battle of the Bulge. It hit in the Ardennes, a region of forests and poor roads, in weather that grounded Allied aircraft and blinded observation. The shock was not just the attack itself, but the scale and ferocity of it. Units were overrun in the first days. Entire regiments were cut off. The American front bent under pressure in a way it had not since Normandy. The casualty numbers would be staggering: tens of thousands killed, wounded, missing, captured, making it the bloodiest battle American forces fought in the European theater. But Patton understood something deeper the moment he heard. This wasn't just a surprise attack. This was the result of time. After the war, German officers would confirm what Patton believed. The force used in the Ardennes was assembled during those months when Allied momentum slowed. Divisions, fuel, ammunition, everything needed to strike hard had been gathered, while Allied armies fought supply shortages and pursued operations that consumed resources without delivering the decisive break. Patton's reaction was bitter, because bitterness was what you felt when you watched a preventable nightmare arrive on schedule. "This is what happens," he said, "when you give me enough gas to hold ground, but not enough to take ground." We let them recover. Now they get to pick when and where to hit us. Patton did not stay frozen for long once the Bulge began. His ability to pivot Third Army north and drive toward Bastogne became one of the most famous operational responses of the war. But even that dramatic movement, the speed, the improvisation, the relentless push only reinforced his argument. Momentum saves lives. Delay costs them. By early spring of 1945, Allied forces were finally pressing toward the Rhine, Germany's great defensive barrier. The river was not just water, it was a symbol, a line the Germans believed could slow the inevitable. On March 7th, 1945 First Army captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, securing a crossing that shocked German command. It was the first Allied foothold over the Rhine, seized by opportunity and boldness. But Montgomery had his own grand crossing planned for weeks, Operation Plunder scheduled for March 23rd and March 24, 1945 It would be enormous, methodical, and public. Artillery preparation, airborne support, set-piece grandeur. It would be the kind of operation that looked like history being made on purpose. Patton watched this unfolding and felt something harden inside him. This was not just about the Rhine anymore. This was about everything since Lorraine. Every stalled tank, every wasted day, every resource diverted north while he sat and waited. Montgomery's crossing would be a masterpiece on film. Patton's crossing, if he could seize it, would be a masterpiece of war. On March 22nd, 1945 Patton's reconnaissance elements found a lightly defended crossing point at Oppenheim, south of Mainz. This was the kind of opening Patton lived for an enemy weakness, a seam, a moment. He didn't ask permission. He didn't request elaborate preparation. He didn't wait for someone else's schedule. That night, March 22nd into March 23rd, 1945, elements of the 5th Infantry Division slipped across the Rhine in assault boats. In darkness, under tension, men paddled and pushed and waded, landed on the far bank, and began digging in before the Germans fully understood what was happening. By dawn, there was a bridgehead. By midday, engineers were working to turn that foothold into permanence. Only when he knew it was real, only when he knew the crossing could not be undone with a quick counterattack, did Patton pick up the phone and call Bradley. The conversation was brief, but it carried months of frustration and a sharp edge of satisfaction. "Brad," Patton said, "don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley paused. "Where?" "The Rhine," Patton replied, almost savoring the words. "I sneaked the division over last night. We're across and expanding." Bradley, who understood exactly what this meant to Patton, answered with genuine disbelief and a kind of admiration he couldn't hide. "Well, I'll be damned. You mean across the Rhine?" Patton confirmed it. He had crossed Germany's last great defensive river without months of theatrical planning, without airborne spectacle, without the overwhelming resource concentration that had been denied him for so long. It was the purest expression of what he had always argued. Speed and initiative can do what bureaucracy and caution cannot. Then Patton said the line that revealed what truly burned inside him. "I want the world to know. Third Army made it before Monty." It wasn't about being first overall. First Army had already crossed at Remagen. This was personal. It was vindication. It was proof, delivered in cold river water and midnight assault boats, that Patton's style of warfare, relentless momentum, opportunistic aggression, could beat elaborate preparation when the enemy was already collapsing. On March 23rd, 1945 Montgomery's Operation Plunder began, massive, powerful, meticulously staged. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of guns, airborne drops, and a parade of observers. Even political leaders came to watch. Cameras documented the crossing. Press coverage framed it as an epic turning point. The spectacle was undeniable. Patton watched with a bitter satisfaction that never quite became joy. He had crossed the same river a day earlier with less drama and more risk, driven by the very instincts he'd been punished for in Lorraine. His soldiers had done it in the dark with grit and speed, not as a grand performance, but as a practical act of war. Yet the spotlight lingered where it always lingered. On the planned show, not the improvised strike. When Eisenhower visited crossings, the contrast stung. Montgomery's operation received time, attention, praise for cameras. Patton's bridgehead, achieved with audacity, felt like an afterthought. But once across the Rhine, with supplies finally flowing, Patton did exactly what he had promised he could do back in September if he'd been allowed to keep moving. Third Army didn't creep into Germany. It raced. Armor columns surged forward, bypassing resistance, leaving infantry to mop up pockets behind them. German units trying to form defensive lines found American tanks already behind them. The tempo was shocking. It was German blitzkrieg turned against Germany itself, proving that the doctrine of speed was not uniquely German, it belonged to whoever had the nerve to use it. Patton's forces liberated camps, seized cities, and drove deep into Central Europe. And as the end approached, another halt order came, this time not because of fuel, but because of politics. Berlin would be taken by the Soviets. Agreements had been made. Lines on a map mattered now as much as rivers. Patton's reaction was as bitter as ever, because bitterness was what you felt when you believed you could see a faster end and were ordered to stop. He insisted, sometimes in private, sometimes too loudly, that if he'd been given the fuel in September, instead of seeing resources poured into northern gambles and political necessities, the war might have ended sooner, that the Bulge might never have happened, that thousands might have lived. After the war, the argument never truly died. Supporters of Eisenhower and Montgomery defended the logic of concentration and the realities of Allied logistics. They argued that the supply system could not sustain every army at full speed, that Antwerp had to be opened, that Market Garden failed in execution rather than concept, that coalition warfare demanded a careful hand. Patton's advocates countered that the September pause was one of the great strategic errors of the European campaign, that it allowed Germany to recover, dig in, and strike back, and that momentum once lost could never be regained cheaply. German testimony added fuel to the debate. High-ranking officers admitted that early September had been a dangerous time for them, a time of confusion and weakness, when defenses were being assembled with scraps. Some stated openly that sustained Allied pressure might have broken through before Germany could rebuild coherent lines. It was exactly the point Patton had been shouting while his tanks sat near the Moselle. Yet even those sympathetic to Patton's argument conceded the brutal fact of logistics. Armies cannot run on courage alone. Fuel depots, transport trucks, ports, roads, these were the hidden battlefield. And Eisenhower, unlike Patton, had to balance not just operational opportunities, but alliance realities, British prestige, American pressure, political optics, and the fragile unity of nations fighting side by side all weighed on every decision. Eisenhower later acknowledged that national prestige was always present, that political considerations could not simply be ignored. In coalition warfare, victory is not only a matter of tactics, it is a matter of keeping allies together long enough to win. Patton did not live long enough to see history settle into whatever verdict it would eventually choose. He died in December 1945 after a car accident, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance, controversy, and unanswered what if. Over time, many historians would look back at late summer 1944 and argue that the opportunity was real, that German weakness was more severe than Allied leaders admitted, and that different allocation of fuel and supply could have produced a faster ending. Others would argue the opposite, that a single thrust would have been dangerously exposed, that German counterattacks could have cut spearheads off, and that the Allied supply network was stretched to the breaking point, no matter what strategy was chosen. But even in that debate, one thing remains hard to ignore. Patton's aggressive logistics, the very behavior that caused complaints and outrage, was rooted in a truth about mobile warfare. The commander who seizes resources and keeps moving can create outcomes that careful planners never reach. In a fast campaign, delay is not neutral. Delay is lethal. And that is why the story of Patton stealing supplies isn't really about trucks, paperwork, or military discipline. It's about the cost of hesitation when the enemy is wobbling. It's about the tragedy of being right in war at the wrong moment and paying for that timing with months of blood. Patton believed momentum was life. He believed speed could substitute for mass. He believed a defeated enemy must be kept defeated, because the enemy you allow to escape today is the enemy you will face tomorrow. Stronger, dug in, and ready to kill your men on ground of his choosing. In the autumn of 1944, Patton watched the opportunity slip away, while engines went silent and mud thickened on the roads. He watched a war that felt close stretch back out into winter. Then, in the Ardennes, the enemy proved what time could buy. By the time Patton finally got his vindication, by the time he crossed the Rhine ahead of Montgomery and raced into Germany, the proof came too late to undo what had already happened. It could not erase the casualties. It could not rewind the months. It could not bring back the men lost in a winter offensive that might never have existed if the road to Germany had been exploited when it was open. Being right too late is its own kind of burden. Patton carried it. He argued, he raged, he improvised, he seized what he could, and when the chance finally returned, he struck with the same speed he'd been demanding all along. He proved his point in the dark waters of the Rhine, in the relentless drive across Germany, and in the stunned reactions of commanders who watched Third Army move like a blade. But history's cruelest irony remained. Vindication does not resurrect the dead. And so the question lingers like a shadow behind the map. Patton stared at near Reims on August 31st, 1944, the moment the phone rang and the engines fell silent. Not whether Patton was right to be furious, not whether Market Garden was bold or reckless, not whether Eisenhower had reasons a coalition commander could not escape, but whether that one decision, fuel, priority, politics stretched the war just long enough for Germany to recover, just long enough to strike back, just long enough to turn a late summer chase into a winter bloodbath. Because in war, the moments you pause are the moments the enemy uses to breathe. And once he can breathe again, he can fight again.